Today we discuss the agricultural revolution, which is very topical at the moment. By the agricultural revolution, I mean a series of innovations and changes in practice that moved farming from peasantries, as they were in the feudal period, into the modern age. But I think first it's worth discussing the political context in the 18th century when the agricultural revolution took place. As with most periods, the British Parliament had a progressive and a conservative faction, which today is the Labour Party and the Conservatives, and then before that it's been the Conservatives and the Liberals, and in the 18th century it was the Whigs and the Tories. But because we're talking about a long time ago, the Whigs, being the progressive faction, are actually what we would call conservative today. One of the prominent Whigs, Lord Rockingham's private secretary, was called Edmund Burke, and he was a political theorist who is now known as the father of conservatism. In this period, British society was essentially rural, and all of the politicians were aristocrats, so they had massive estates and lived in enormous houses. And there weren't very many of them either. In 1688 there were just 160 lords, and that number stayed pretty much stable for the entirety of the 18th century. But this closed circle of aristocratic power put farming right at the heart of government. The Whigs had a fairly free hand for most of the 18th century, because in 1688 King James II and VI was deposed for being a Catholic, because Catholics must be loyal to the Pope rather than Britain, so they can't really be trusted. This was a Whig effort, and the Tories opposed it on the basis of Britain being King James's inheritance and his property being a very important concept in the 18th century. So James gets replaced by Protestants, but in 1714 Queen Anne dies, and then the Whigs need to find another Protestant to take the throne. So the Whigs look to Europe, and they find a George, 4 of them actually, to take the British throne. But James and his descendants still make claims on the throne, and they invade a couple of times, which makes the Tories seem very disloyal to the Georgian crown. And the Georges respond to this by giving the Whigs most of the power for most of the 18th century in something called the Whig ascendancy. This is important because the Tories are pushed out, but with them a lot of affection for pre-modern feudal land practices are kept out of government. This paved the way for a series of reforms and innovations that would become known as the agricultural revolution. Feudal agriculture generally used a 3-field system, in which 3 large fields would be set out around a village and cultivated by peasants in strips. And each field would grow a different crop that would be rotated around each year. The first year a field would grow wheat. The second year it would grow other things like barley and peas and beans, and in the third year it would be left empty and no crop would be sown in something called a fallow. And the idea of a fallow was to rest the soil and allow it to recover. But as rotation was being practiced, you would have 1 crop of each thing every year. But this system wasn't very efficient, because a third of the land was unproductive all of the time. And fallows just aren't very good, because if you remove nutrients from a soil with a harvest, just leaving the soil doesn't really do anything. Like, sure, some nutrients might return to it through rain and sun, but at the end of the day, it's not going to restore fertility. Your productivity was low. But in the medieval time, that didn't matter because the population was small. But in the 18th century, the population was increasing, and these people needed food. Most people were excluded from participating formally in politics, so they would voice their desires instead through riots, which often attacked the price of food. Benjamin Franklin observed, "I have seen within a year riots in the country about corn, about workhouses, of colliers, of weavers, of coal hewers, of Wilksites, of government chairmen, of smugglers." Rioting was seen as very English and not necessarily a bad thing. There was no police force in the 18th century because it was seen as French, because they had one in Paris, and potentially tyrannical. But these riots made food shortages a very visible recurring problem. They got particularly bad in 1766, where events like the Nottingham cheese riots saw mobs erect roadblocks to prevent the movement of cheese. The people were so exasperated that their violence broke loose like a torrent. Cheeses were rolled down Wheelergate and Peck Lane in abundance. Many others were carried away, and the mayor, in endeavouring to restore peace, was knocked down with one in the open fair. So this greater population was providing both an economic and political incentive to produce more food. And agricultural innovation was spurred on by the fact that high politics was so closely tied to the landed interest. Agricultural big fish Charles Turnip Townshend was the brother-in-law of our first Prime Minister Robert Walpole. The famous agriculturalist Arthur Young worked as a parliamentary reporter, and the government initiated a series of surveys into the agricultural state of every single county, so people knew what was going on. Parliament facilitated the enclosure of the old feudal manors into private farms, replacing the peasant-based 3-field system with private farmers who could innovate and reap the benefits themselves. In essence, this was the birth of the farming community as we understand it today. But the aristocracy remained incredibly important. They didn't have peasants anymore, but they did have tenants who rented their farms from them. It's easy to see these landlords as economic parasites, and in some cases they almost certainly were. But with the Enclosure Acts, the idea of a good landlord emerged who was not an economic parasite, but helped his tenants financially with capital improvements and in times of hardship, and helped in fostering new practices and technologies on their estates. The landlord and the tenant were not supposed to be at odds with each other, but partners in husbandry. This idea of a good landlord as a partner in husbandry remained until the Second World War, when this film was made.
Sir Thomas Cook, by his methods of soil improvement, turned his land from an unproductive waste, where 2 rabbits fought for every blade of grass, into a rich and prosperous farm. In the grounds at Holcombe Hall stands a monument to this pioneer farmer, one of the most enlightened landlords of his day, who devoted himself to the improvement of British farming and encouraged his tenants to do the same.
Arthur Young wrote of this relationship at the time. He wrote that when he visited an Englishman's house, there would be 3 or 4 farmers asked to meet me, who would have dined with the family amongst the ladies of first rank. I do not exaggerate when I say I have had this at least 100 times in the first houses of our islands. Before the 1760s, grain prices weren't particularly good, which meant that a lot of the agricultural innovation relied on aristocratic patronage and cooperation with tenants. But from the 1760s, grain prices picked up a bit, and there was a boom in enclosure. But from this point until the Second World War, landlords gave less and less practical support to their tenants. So we see this establishment of a new role for the aristocracy as good landlords, but we also see the beginning of its decline. But that's another episode. Most farmers in the 18th century were tenants. In 1790, about 3/4 of all British land was cultivated under tenancies, which, in addition to the fact the aristocracy kept farms in hand, means there were very few owner-occupying farmers at all. But farmers did alright in Georgian England. Most villages have really big, quite nice Georgian farmhouses in the middle of them, in my part of the world at least. But anyway, the demand for food had increased and prices with it, and enclosure had set the scene for innovations to be made. Lots of land was drained, which is very important but boring. But then, Robert Bakewell of my own native Leicestershire famously led efforts to improve livestock through selective breeding. Bakewell developed several new breeds by exaggerating desirable traits, including the Leicester Longwool, which in today's world where wool isn't worth anything has become a particularly rare breed. But they managed to do some pretty impressive things. They managed to breed the horns out of some animals to create polled variants, which were safer and less likely to injure each other. And they made the animals bigger and squarer. If you ever see paintings of animals from the 18th century, they are quite amusing because the animals are unrealistically big and perfect rectangles. I used to see paintings like this in National Trust properties and whatnot, and think how silly it was for the painters to pretend that their animals actually look like perfect rectangles. But then I saw this footage of a Hereford draft animal from the Second World War, and they're not that square today, so perhaps in the 18th century animals did actually look like that. But regardless, the fact that these paintings were commissioned shows that agricultural improvement was something that very wealthy people knew a lot about, were engaged in, and were proud of, and wanting to show it off in their paintings. And most of the breeds that we have on British farms today have their origins in this period. The sudden explosion of agricultural improvement was also driven by the dominant philosophical movement at the time, which was the Enlightenment. This championed empiricism and knowledge, essentially science, and people set about applying it to agriculture just as it was being applied to other areas like politics and academia. Farming became a scientific endeavour. Dozens of agricultural improvement societies sprang up all around the country, sharing books and journals and lectures. To this end, farmers would travel Europe observing practices and introduce improvements when they returned home. This led to the introduction from the continent of clover by Sir Richard Weston and turnips by Charles Turnip Townshend. And they facilitated the widespread adoption of what became known as the Norfolk 4-course rotation. This replaced the unproductive 3-field system by completely dispensing with fallows and instead keeping the land productive every year by rotating between wheat, turnips, barley and clover. This tied animals into crop production in a way they hadn't been before. The turnips could feed the improved animals in the winter, while the clover restored fertility to the soil and the animals could be grazed on it and their manure would do the same. So the rotation of these crops allowed the soil to remain in good heart and be continuously productive without the need for fallows. On a side note, this means we haven't needed fallows since the 1730s, and the Norfolk 4-course rotation isn't really innovative, because really it was just imported from Belgium where they'd been doing it for 200 years. So in the 18th century, people already knew that it worked. But now, in the 21st century, the government is now spending public money paying farmers to put fallows back in. So people are paying taxes for something literally medieval that nobody benefits from. Mechanisation of agriculture also happened in this period. Jethro Tull, who inspired the band of the same name, like many others, travelled to Europe and set about trying to apply the scientific spirit of the Enlightenment to agriculture. In 1701, he invented the seed drill, which put seeds actually in the ground at a particular depth and spacing and then covered them over again with soil. With this, he believed he had essentially solved agriculture. His book, Horse Hoeing Husbandry, presented an empirical discussion of what plants need to survive. Unfortunately, he was completely wrong, but he believed that soil released nutrients when you broke it into smaller particles, so he thought if you kept ploughing and cultivating and hoeing ground, you would split it into smaller and smaller particles and it would continue releasing nutrients, and he thought you could do this forever. Division may be mathematically infinite, for an atom is nothing, Neither is there a more plain impossibility in nature than to reduce matter to nothing by division and separation of its parts. So Tull believed that he had invented an entirely new form of agriculture that not only did away with fallows, but also did away with manure. It would completely remove animals from the agricultural cycle. He thought that if his drill sowed the rows of crop far enough apart, it would allow the use of another machine, the horse hoe, between the rows. And then continual hoeing of the soil while the crop was growing would essentially stir it up and release nutrients. In promoting this, Tull was going against agricultural best practice established way before the Roman period and was slammed for it by his contemporaries. Stirring soil to expose it to air does release nutrients, so this method would have maintained yields slightly longer than otherwise, which is presumably how Tull became mistaken. But he was wrong about manuring. You still need to put nutrients back into the soil, and his farm soon became exhausted. But of course, the soil could be manured and this problem would be fixed, and Tull's contributions were of great value anyway. Hoeing by horse was much more efficient than doing it by hand, and seed drills protected seeds from birds that would otherwise just eat them off the surface. Tull's genius is seen in the fact that we still use machines like this today. In 1782, James Cook presented an improved version which was soon developed into the Suffolk drill, which is essentially the same technology we still use in our combi drill. Machines in this period were often named after counties because there would be regional variations in design to suit soil types. We don't want to give the aristocracy and the famous names the credit for all of these improvements. Farmers were the people that actually enacted them, they just wrote less books. But in Arthur Young's Survey of Oxfordshire, he provides hundreds of anecdotes of ordinary farmers embracing the scientific spirit and offering musings on their practices and discoveries. This involves farmers looking critically at the landscape since enclosure and its ability to yield improvements. Mr. Latham considers hedges as very bad for corn and had much rather be without them. They adapt their practices to what they find works best empirically, and even if what works on their land might not be considered best practice more widely. Mr. Sotham of Stonesfield sows in August if rain permits, as these are sure to be the best crops. They try out different things to see what works, and they learn from experience. Mr. Davy feeds his sheep with the straw of peas and beans, preferring the latter, but given plentiful they may only pick off the pods. They have turnips also. We find new breeds are seized upon. Mr. T. Payne of Drayton finds the new Leicester by far the most profitable stock, and new technologies are assessed critically on their merits. Mr. Singleton of Bampton drills his wheat at 9 or 10 inches, hoes it and succeeds greatly. He much approves this husbandry. The parallels to the present day are remarkable. Most of the features of modern agriculture were present in the 18th century and were adopted by regular farmers. These include scientific land improvement with drainage and land reclamation. Fertilizers like seaweed and lime were imported to maintain fertility. Mechanisation was established and selective breeding revolutionized animal husbandry. These things are often characterized as modern, or at least industrial, but farming as we know it today had its genesis in the 1700s. The improvements in productivity achieved during this period allowed continued population growth and an increase in urbanisation. People often say that this paves the way for the Industrial Revolution, but I think it also has some interesting political ramifications that we're still dealing with today. Property and its ownership and the rights to it were absolutely central to 18th century society, and the democracies that we still have in the West were developed in this period, most explicitly in America when their constitution was designed, but also in Britain we see the office of Prime Minister emerge and political parties as we understand them today start to take shape. But democracy in this period was based on property. It wasn't the popular democracy that we understand today, although that idea does emerge towards the end of the period under Charles James Fox, although for this he's considered a bit of a and perhaps more importantly a hypocrite. Voting in elections had a property qualification. Until 1832 you needed to own 40 shillings worth of rent of property. The entire electorate for most of the 18th century was in the hundreds of thousands. But as these democratic institutions were designed, the people who created them held these property qualifications absolutely central, and they endured for a really long time, the last ones being removed in Britain in 1948. These were intended to stop poor people having a say, but that was for a reason. The idea was that if somebody owns property, they have something to lose. So even if they themselves are very ignorant, they will know that it's in their best interest to vote for somebody sensible to govern for them. The poor, meanwhile, literally have nothing to lose but their chains, so they can be much more politically volatile. I'm not trying to depict any particular demographic as right or wrong, but if you look at elections, people with different levels of wealth do vote differently. But I think as our democracies developed, exploiting that fact was quite a central feature. This is seen very explicitly in America, where the Northwest Ordinance set out what Thomas Jefferson believed would be the perfect republican society that was eventually consolidated into the state of Ohio. This did contain popular democracy, but married it to the idea that all citizens would own property, or more specifically, the citizens were intended to be farmers, and they would be self-sufficient, so they would have something to lose, being their farms, their property, but would be unaffected by broader stuff happening in the country and would be politically independent and essentially inert. Jefferson wrote of the US population, "Most of the labouring class possess property, cultivate their own lands, have families. Can any condition of society be more desirable than this?" He also said, "It is not too soon to provide by every means possible that as few as possible shall be without a little portion of land. The small landholders are the most precious part of the state." He greatly feared the corrupting effects of money power on democracy because he felt if somebody was a wage labourer, they were reliant on somebody else and therefore not independent and susceptible to manipulation. I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberty than standing armies. So the political institutions that we have in Britain and America are designed around this principle of property. But as that has been overtaken by ideas of popular democracy, we've simply dealt with this in Britain by removing the property qualification and creating urban constituencies. But this has left the rest of the 18th century institutions that were built around the property qualification entirely in place. I'm not trying to suggest that we should reinstate the property qualification, but rather that the politicians of the 18th century failed to recognise the significance of the agricultural revolution and the demographic changes that it would produce. British and American democracies were essentially designed to cater for aristocrats and farmers, but these technological innovations displaced labour from the land and meant there was enough food to support more people in cities. So over time, farmers have diminished as a proportion of the electorate, and now we're struggling to make 18th century institutions work within a 21st century conception of popular democracy. Just some food for thought, let me know what you think. But even without the political element, these demographic changes are hugely important because they produced the situation that we had before the Second World War, where farmers had become a tiny impoverished minority. And then, in the Second World War, the government makes the same mistake, and they have this huge leap in technology, but they fail to predict the demographic effects it's going to have, which produces the situation we're in now. So the agricultural revolution is very much the start of something great in the British countryside, but at the same time it seems to mark the beginning of the perhaps terminal decline of the rural population in Britain, which is something that we shall trace through to the present day, so please do stick around. Goodbye.